Hey folks, welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today we're going to be talking about what we seem to be talking about at least half of the time, which is will there or won't there be a hostage ceasefire deal? So, not a lot has happened since last time we talked about this, except for a whole bunch of noise, but there are signs that Hamas is ready to give a qualified, positive answer to the Egyptian ceasefire offer. That offer involves the return of between 20 and 40 hostages in return for about 50 prisoners per hostage, and Israel removing most of its checks for Palestinians returning from the south to the north, the ceasefire of 1 day per each hostage, with a guarantee to move to a second phase where there will be discussions about the end of the war. It's the most forthcoming offer that Israel has made, and therefore we were hearing some noises from Hamas yesterday that they're on the verge of accepting. Here's what a source in Hamas told the Quds network yesterday, quote, "The Egyptian offer is the best we've seen in the last few months. It includes an Israeli withdrawal from spots it insisted on holding. Israel accepts the return of the displaced without conditions and has given up the idea that they will not return." So that was an encouraging one. Meanwhile, the Arab World Press reports that, quote, "The Egyptian offer is acceptable to both sides, but there is still a disagreement over how many hostages will be released. But none of this means that the deal will be completely accepted as is." Ehud Ya'ari, the veteran channel for Arab affairs, the analyst for Channel 12, says that Sinwar has already decided that he will say a qualified no while asking for clarifications and improvements. Ya'ari says the answer will be that, quote, "Sinwar sees progress but not enough progress, and therefore it has a list of clarifications and issues he asks to be discussed in more specific terms. He will also make clear that he isn't scared of an operation in Rafah. He doesn't think this is a turning point that will change the entire operation." End quote. Speaking of Rafah, after those optimistic quotes yesterday, Netanyahu has made a few steps to show a also qualified disinterest in the deal. When put together, they paint an interesting picture. So here's what they were. Netanyahu met with the Forum of the right-wing hostage families. He's notably more welcoming to them than the left-wing hostage families, not surprisingly. He told them, quote, "We will enter Rafah and eliminate the battalions there, whether or not there is a deal." And few people I've talked to have mentioned the fact that the problem with this is it removes the threat of the stick of Rafah. The stick of Rafah, the threat of invading, helps and works when Hamas feel they can avoid it with a deal. If Israel is insisting that it'll go in either way, it kind of makes that threat meaningless, which is one of the reasons Sinwar is saying, "I'm not scared of an operation in Rafah, especially since it might happen anyway." Netanyahu also canceled the cabinet meeting that was supposed to convene today to discuss the deal. Uh, and only a few hours later did he announce that it will be held on Thursday instead. He also uh, canceled the arrival of the delegation in Cairo to continue talks, saying that that should wait until Hamas gives their answer. And then he met with Ben-Gvir, who then gave a press conference in the prime minister's office, which is unprecedented. That's considered quite disrespectful for a minister to do that while questioning the prime minister's policy. He threatened to leave the government if there was an irresponsible deal. Ben-Gvir also said that Netanyahu promised Israel would go into Rafah and not make an irresponsible deal. And, quote, "Netanyahu knew what will happen if he doesn't live up to his promise." A threat if I've ever seen one. Now, these steps put together indicate a certain disinterest in the deal, as I said. Best case scenario, this is posturing in order to pressure Hamas into accepting the deal and to stop them from extorting Israel. If so, I fully support it. Good idea. There is a chance that it's more than that, and Netanyahu is panicking at threats from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that they will leave the government over a deal. I certainly hope that's not the case. Meanwhile, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot have said that they will leave the government if a deal is not signed. So basically, we have a problem here for Netanyahu that if Hamas says yes, he may have to choose between Gantz and Eisenkot and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Of course, in that case, we know he tends to prefer right-wing partners who he feels are more reliable. Although, honestly, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have not proven particularly reliable. They're the ones constantly threatening to upend the government. So we'll see how that goes. But he doesn't trust Gantz, understandably so, who he sees as a rival who might want to sink the government if it depends on him at the most opportune moment. Now, something that's really undermining Netanyahu's negotiation stance is public opinion in Israel. In the last video, I said I would like to see some polls on whether the Israeli public wants a deal or wants to go into Rafah. And apparently they were listening because I got what I asked for, and I've seen a few of those. The most complete one was published by Channel 11, Kan 11, and this is what the polling number said. 54% of the Israeli public support the Egyptian brokered deal as it stands. Only 26% are against. That's quite dramatic, more than I would expect. As for a complete deal to end the war, as in releasing all hostages, releasing all prisoners, and Israel completely and totally withdrawing, 47% are for and 30%, 2% are against. So similar, a little bit less, but similar. Also, not something I expected. As for do you believe Netanyahu is doing enough to get the hostages out? This was more predictable. 59% said no, 29% said he is. Also, do you believe Netanyahu when he says we are a step away from victory? 65% said no, and 17% said yes. And that is what's behind this change of heart in the Israeli public. The sense that even if Israel continues the war, very few in the Israeli public, only 17% believe that Israel is close to victory. If you asked, can Israel win this war? My guess would be that a majority would say no, although a smaller majority than that. Too bad they didn't ask that. Now, here's the thing. With that kind of public pressure and with all the international pressure, Israel really can't afford to say no. Hamas has to be seen as the party refusing. Otherwise, Israel cannot be in that position. I think that a series of terrible events may occur if Israel is the one that says no, if Netanyahu says no in order to safeguard his government. Gantz will leave the government. A lot of people are skeptical about this, and I can see why. Gantz is often threatened to leave the government. But I think now the pressure is so great, he will have to. And part of that is Eisenkot, and part of that is the family of the hostages. I think he'll have to. That would put Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as the new de facto policymakers. We don't know if that would really change Israeli policy all that much. Probably would to some extent, but it would tarnish the Israeli image. And the Israeli image is already so tarnished that a further one could start a spiral, what people in Israel used to call a diplomatic tsunami. I'm concerned that the following things might happen. The U.S. might begin to limit arms sales to Israel. The State Department has already said that because of Israeli violations of human rights, the U.S. should do that, and Biden may approve it. UN Security Council resolutions against Israel may pass because the United States will likely abstain rather than vetoing. Those could include sanctions. The EU could begin some economic sanctions. The ICJ is more likely, sorry, to rule that Israel is committing apartheid, genocide. The ICC is more likely to set out arrest warrants against Netanyahu, Halevi, and Gallant. The protests in the U.S. in the colleges will escalate and move from one country to the other. They'll spread. The protests in Israel will escalate exponentially as more and more people come to support the families of the hostages, feeling that Netanyahu has abandoned them. The displaced Israelis in the north and the south will not be able to return home, especially the north. The south are in better shape. The PA Hamas unity government may emerge. It's already being brokered by China as we speak. The hostages will die, more Palestinian civilians will die. Iran will try to take advantage of Israeli isolation to attack it. While all this is done, Israel will lose the war anyway. My guess is that Sinwar will use his advantage at the negotiating table because he has all these things working for him to milk more concessions out of Israel and close the deal in just a few days. So I am not completely pessimistic as to the chances of getting a deal, but the deal might end up favoring Hamas even more. Nonetheless, because of the list of concerns I have, what happens if Israel refuses? Israel needs to go as far as it can um, to make sure that Hamas is seen as the side that refuses. James Baker talked about how in negotiations it's important to what he called leave the dead cat on the other guy's doorstep to make it seem that the other side is the one that killed the negotiations. Israel has to make sure that that dead cat is on Hamas's doorstep, not its own. Otherwise, the consequences domestically and internationally will be very severe. But I really hope that a deal is arrived at. As you know, I've long time been an advocate for continuing this war to its end, to defeating Hamas and to creating an alternative government. But I no longer believe that the Israeli government is capable or willing to do that. And therefore, I think the best outcome for Israel right now is to get the hostages out. Okay, so here are some questions. As always, great questions. FRDZ4KB asks, and as always, we have a dialogue over being optimistic or pessimistic. The performance of the Israeli government over the past 6 months doesn't fill me with confidence, although I am trying to be optimistic. Here is a question. Why is Netanyahu so suddenly afraid and surprised the ICC will issue warrants? The ICC, like many other countries, the UN, Friends of Israel, ICJ, have telegraphed for months that Israel needs to change the way it conducts the war and treats Palestinian civilians, and Netanyahu and Halevi gave them the finger. What did they expect to happen when we still have reports of Israeli airstrikes killing little kids, and there's obviously no aggressive move by the IDF to hold soldiers and officers accountable for criminal misconduct? So, this is a good question, and it would be a very relevant and interesting one if Israel didn't run its current policy um, by sort of muddling through situations and putting out fires as they emerge. The best way to understand this decision on the ICC that nothing was done to prevent this is that Netanyahu was completely and totally focused on the internal issues and the stability of his coalition instead of the foreign ramifications of his actions. And that's why there have been so many disasters regarding the ramifications of his actions externally, because he wasn't paying attention to that. He was willing to sacrifice it. This is the first time, it seems to me, that Netanyahu has run into consequences from his international handling of things that he feels will harm him on every level and that he cannot control. He's very comfortable dealing with American politics. He's very comfortable manipulating that to try to get sympathy at home. But the ICC is a whole new ball game for him, and he knows that if those warrants are issued, he will look like a pariah, and Israelis will turn on him even more than they already have, feeling that he's turned Israel into a country that's completely ostracized in the world, and he won't be able to visit most countries in the world without ending up in prison. So he just didn't pay enough attention to this issue, hoping that it would be okay, and it hasn't turned out to be okay. And I think this ICC thing is a very big deal, and it makes it more likely for there to be a ceasefire because what I'm hearing from everyone is that he is panicking about this and talking about very little else. It was the number one issue on the latest government meeting ahead of hostages, ahead of the war, even though on paper it's less important. And he's been calling everyone, trying to get them to pressure the ICC, including the families of the hostages. He's been trying to get them to pressure the ICC because they have a pretty good relationship with the ICC ever since they put in a complaint against Hamas. Um, the same person also asked, how is your experience with the online world since you started this channel? Lots of crazies, positive and negative. It's been a 6 month journey with lots of emotions on all sides. So I have to say, YouTube is a lot calmer than Twitter. I spend a lot of my time on Twitter. On Twitter, I get called all sorts of things all day long by right wing Jews, by pro Palestinians, by all sorts of people. Here on YouTube, I occasionally get a slightly nasty comment or something like that, but it's very tame in comparison. My experience on this channel has been really spectacularly good. It's grown quicker than I thought. All of you who ask questions are amazing. Nice comments, lots of good feedback, great questions. Very happy with it. Vanna Loven asks, can we get a full breakdown from the likely to absurd over how and when there might be a change of government in Israel? Okay, yeah. So everyone always asks me how we can get rid of Netanyahu. Everyone who, is on the side of sanity and wants to get rid of him. And so basically, let's try to put order into this chaos. There's two ways you can get rid of a sitting prime minister. Well, three ways. One is not going to happen. One is Netanyahu will resign. Very hard to imagine that. Of course, with the ICC, maybe it's a little bit more imaginable. Maybe someone will come up with a deal. We won't prosecute you if you resign, but I still don't see it. So that leaves us with two other options. One is that there is a vote of no confidence against the government. That would require 61 members of Knesset to vote against him. Um, that can't happen as long as he controls a functioning government that wants to stay in power. That would require one of the um, core parties of this coalition. So not Gantz and Eisenkot, because they're not a core member of the coalition. The core members of the coalition voting for elections. The only ones I can see doing that are Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, possibly, if they don't like the deal. If that happens, the question is, are the left gonna save his ass? Lapid and Gantz said they would, but that might be temporary. Another possibility would be that the Haredi parties, because of the Haredi draft law, which is going to be again coming back to the headlines in May. We've forgotten about it a little bit, but the court is going to deliberate on that. If that can't be solved, they could also join in a no confidence vote. Members of the Likud could rebel against Netanyahu and join in a no confidence vote. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. Then you have a third possibility. The members of the coalition band together to replace Netanyahu. The Likud would have to lead that move. So at some point, and this might be the most likely thing, the Likud could decide that Netanyahu is so harmful for their party's prospects that they want to replace him with someone else who's more palatable. This might happen if the war ends with an Israeli defeat. Netanyahu, knowing him, he'd probably survive that too, but he would have to scramble. There'd be people out for his head after that kind of failure. So those are the three ways that could happen. As you can see, none of them seem particularly imminent, but they are possible. And of course, there's always a distinct possibility Netanyahu could survive till 2026 when there are elections. Hard to believe that Netanyahu could win elections ever again. He's always amazed us before, but I think the stench of his failures in this war and October 7th make that impossible, but he surprised me before. Sonny LaBouffe asks, let's assume the government does not change and Netanyahu continues to mismanage this war. I believe this to be a safe assumption. At this stage, do you think it's better to just cut our losses, give Hamas what they're asking for in the talks, and end it? Yes. I've changed my mind about this in the last few days. I mentioned that earlier. I think that this government is never going to do what it has to do to win the war, which is, as I've said many times, take over the entire Gaza Strip and bring in a new government. Unless Israel's willing to do that, this war is just causing Israel a tremendous amount of harm in the international arena, tearing Israeli society apart, killing many Palestinian civilians, putting the hostages in danger. I don't see any point to this anymore. I'm not thinking that we shouldn't have gone to war. Israel had to after October 7th. It'll end up being a little bit like Afghanistan. That was a war that had to happen after September 11th, but ended up being a big failure. Jose Roche asks, what do you think are the chances of the far right quitting the government? What are the chances Lapid keeps his promise to join? How will that affect the war effort? Okay, so there are other questions, so I'll answer them in order. What do you think the chances are of the far right quitting the government? High. If the deal is struck, after all the noise that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich made, they're going to have to leave. Again, Netanyahu is good at these things. Maybe he can save it somehow, but there are high chances. What are the chances of Lapid keeping his promise to join? Lapid didn't promise to join. What he said was he will give them the votes to support them if they pass a hostage deal. And he will do that at least for a little while, but I wouldn't trust him to do that for long. And Netanyahu doesn't trust him to do that for long. You can't really have a minority government in Israel. It doesn't really work that way. How will that affect the war effort? Well, if the right wing, either way, if the right wing quits or the left wing quits, the war is pretty much over because either they're going into that ceasefire, which will be the beginning of talks towards the end of the war, and it'll be very hard to relaunch, or um, there's um, going into Rafah, which I think Israel will be forced to stop the war pretty soon. So I think the war effort is already screwed either way. Are you okay with a hostage deal of any kind if it includes IDF having to withdraw permanently from Gaza? At this point, yes, because unless Israel's going to remove Hamas, what's the point of having the soldiers there as sitting ducks? Also, after the hostages are released, Israel can go back in if it needs to areas that it has to control. So, yes, absolutely. And the IDF agrees with me that that's what needs to be done. Were there any previous deals that the unity government should have taken? Well, again, this brings us back to whether Israel's going to commit its goals or not. If Israel was not going to commit to its goals and not going to try to replace Hamas and bring in another government, it should have taken a deal several months ago to end the war after it had shown Hamas that it meant business, took over Gaza City, destroyed it, etc., etc. So, there's no way Israel could have not done anything. But after showing that it meant business, it should have gotten a deal to end the war. And then it could have shown that it has the ability to destroy Hamas, but chooses not to, and next time it will. So that probably would have been a much better option, considering that, Israel's not willing to destroy Hamas. Also, why do you put sole responsibility on Netanyahu? Netanyahu this, Netanyahu that, when it's a war government? Okay, fair question. I talk a lot about Netanyahu's failures, and there's a few reasons for that. First, if I'm honest, I am livid with Netanyahu for what he's put Israel through, starting with all those elections Israel went through, continuing with the judicial reform, continuing with October 7th, and continuing with this war. So I hold Netanyahu responsible for an absolute disaster that has befallen the country that I love. So there's that. Another thing is that Netanyahu is, for those reasons, more responsible for what's happened than anything else. He's been in power for a very long time. He's behind the concept of the war and so on, so forth. And he's the major decision maker in the war. But more than that, a lot of the other major decision makers wanted to take decisions that may have won the war. Gallant, Gantz, and Eisenkot at various times have supported day after plans that would include a transfer to a Palestinian government in coordination with the United States that may have won the war. Netanyahu was the one who shot it down. So he's responsible for this defeat because my opinion is very clearly that if Israel had adopted a plan for the day after that the United States could help with and bring in a new government to replace Hamas, Israel could win the war. Netanyahu has single-handedly prevented that, and therefore he is responsible for Israeli defeat in this war, and I firmly believe that, and I stand behind that. Finally, People's War asked, are Israeli voters aware of how badly Netanyahu has screwed things up with this war? Yes. I think that American supporters of Israel don't understand how much anger there is at Netanyahu, how little trust he has in Israeli society. I think the poll that I read you gives you some inclination of that. He still has some supporters, but it's not like Trump where he can get, 40 something percent or something like that. With Netanyahu, we're talking about less than 30% of the population that still supports him, something like 20%. The rest are enraged with him. And that includes, at this point, most right wingers, not some right wingers, most right wingers, and all left wingers. And that's, of course, the vast majority of the country. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me. And by the way, we've reached 1,000 followers here. So thank you so much for that. That's helped me monetize this channel. And that's been a goal of mine for a while, so I can get this out to more people and spend more time on this, maybe improve the production values, who knows? And also, if you want to support what I do here more directly, go to my Patreon at Shael Media. And I'm happy to say that tomorrow I'm going to record a new episode of my history podcast, History of the Land of Israel. So look out for that. And I will see you here soon, hopefully with news of a deal that has been completed and hostages that are back home.